Hi, this is Scott Bradfield. We're on chapter 12, I believe, of Ulysses, reading Ulysses in the bathtub. A difficult book to read in the bathtub because there's nowhere to put your elbows. It's quite heavy and it's always getting close to the water. We're in a series of chapters which I find increasingly exasperating whenever I read Ulysses. And they're probably the reason that I think most people stop reading. You can struggle your way through to get to this far, but when you get into the sirens chapter, when you have the symphonic language, and you get into the scene with the citizen, which has great comic scenes in it, but the joke and the frame, the narrative frame of the chapter, is so annoying that you have to skip passages. I mean, I've read it several times, and every time I just have to skip it. There'll be passages of just names of religious people. There'll be passages of jokes on some fairy tale of a land of plenty, and they'll describe all the food that's there. And the actual narrative is too long. It's basically an hour in the pub. Remember, each chapter is an hour, and this chapter's 75 pages. And Joyce's chapters are getting longer. The jokes he's creating to tell the stories. Again, each chapter is going to find a different way to represent this basic reality of one day in the life of Dublin. And the things that are happening in the scene in the bar are not particularly important to almost anything in the story, but we are getting a picture of Bloom at one point and the kind of awful world of the self-described political revolutionaries of Dublin at this time. The people who are, the citizen is this pompous drunk with a blind dog named Gary Owen, and he loves to talk about how wonderful Ireland would be if it weren't for all these foreigners running taking over the country, and then if it weren't that Ireland would be this great maritime power, and it'd be a wonderful place, and everything would be wonderful, and everything would be this land of plenty. So in the course of this long scene in the pub, Joyce keeps interspersing these inflated passages. For example, the very first one we reach is on page 377, and after the narrator meets Joe Hines, who I'm pretty sure owes Bloom money, and we know this from a previous scene, and the narrator collects on bad debts, we have a kind of legal contract. Really, it's just, I won't read them, but when you get to them, they'll sort of stick out. The language of the narrator is this kind of vernacular Irish character, and the language is sometimes very funny in the expressions he uses. But then there'll be an abrupt shift into a sort of, again, Joycean pastiche of language. On this page, it's a pastiche of a contract for a loan and the details of the loan, and everything's overly written. It's just like a legal contract sounds. It's not written for human beings. It's just this really overinflated passage. Then we're going to move on as we move into the pub, and we go see the citizen. I think it's a pub called Barney Kiernan's, which is a famous pub, I guess. I'm sure I went to all these places when I went to Dublin years ago. And then we go into the pub, and we get these long passages. This one's like 2 or 3 pages, which is basically a fairy tale language. So he's telling a fairy tale of a land of plenty and all the wonderful fruits. And it's a joke that we come into this kind of crummy pub, and then we hear this land of bounteous plenty and all this inflated language about the beauty of this fairy tale land that is a satire on the citizen's view of Ireland. You know, it would have been very funny in 2 sentences, but it goes on for 3 pages. And even some of the better prose, you just get, it doesn't help move the scene forward. We meet the citizen's bloody, mangy mongrel, Gary Owen, and he's working for the cause. And then we'll get long passages, which are just names of people. We go into a satire of all the great thinkers when we meet the citizen. We get all this just a page of famous thinkers like Confucius and Napoleon Bonaparte and so forth, because that's how he sees himself and how people see him. Lady Godiva. There's lots of jokes about it's a the Cyclops chapter. Again, the one-eyed guy who really can't see anything with much depth. We go back and forth into the dialogue between the citizen, the narrator, and it's a first-person narrative by a guy whose name I can't remember at the moment. And then we start seeing some of the other characters come in, like Bob Doran shows up, and they talk about Dennis Breen walks past in his bath slippers. He's the guy who wants to sue somebody for putting the word up through his mailbox, I think it was. And he's going all over town. And there's some very funny passages in here. So there's perfectly funny passages, but they're interrupted by these long-winded jokes on being long-winded. Here's another one. God, it goes on for... Most of them go on for a page. You can tell when we shift from the kind of vernacular of the narrator and go into this heightened language. We have satires on fairy tales, political language, legal language, romantic language, and basically there are ways of telling the story in language which is over the top and over detailed. Bloom shows up. We keep talking about his cod's eye. He's got a fish eye. And they start talking about various things such as capital punishment. At one point, they start talking about some of the hanging of the various martyrs of the political cause in Ireland, people who fought to get England out. We have a long passage, a big romantic passage on page 396 that goes on for about 4 pages, about, it's more than that, 4 to 6 pages about the hanging of one of these sort of political martyrs. And the joke is that we get this inflated language, and then when we come back into the bar, they say things like, God blimey, if she ain't a clinker, that there bleeding tart. So we go back and forth from this romantic language to the way these guys are talking. I don't want to spend too much time on this chapter. I find it really annoying. It's almost everything that pisses me off about Joyce's Ulysses. I want to say this too. He wasn't a novelist. I think this is the part that he wrote one good novel before this, which was Portrait of the Artist, which is an interesting novel. And then in this one, there's some brilliant passages. He was obviously a brilliant narrative thinker. But at the same time, he was so busy proving himself and testing the limits of the novel that it's not, he's just not a novelist. And when you get into passages like this, I think you have to admit that. So we come back, Bloom comes in looking for Martin Cunningham because they're still trying to pay insurance to the family. The inflated language comes in and out very quickly sometimes. And there's a satire there's a satire in 409 about the way political, like a parliamentary meeting would be reported, and the way the right honorable gentleman is this and the right honorable gentleman says that, and it's basically a bunch of drunks sitting around a table. That's 2 pages of a joke. Lots of long lists of names when he goes into these things where he wants to give the names of all the preachers and all the priests and all the famous political people. We have it taken off on journalese, the sort of rubbish that goes into newspapers, where they're going on and on. Again, it's 75 pages long, so I don't want to spend too much more time than to say that if you get into this chapter and you want to have, if you enjoy these little passages, even the narrative stuff where we have the drunks sitting around talking are kind of aimless, and it's like Joyce just wants to touch all these bases about what these guys would talk about. There's a very important passage where the citizen starts talking about how if it weren't for England, if we were free, and if it weren't for these Jews coming in, because he's very prejudiced against the Jews, such as Bloom coming in, then Ireland would be this mighty power in the ocean, and their ships would be cresting the waves. And so we have a little passage about the mighty maritime nation of Ireland. Again, none of it really helps advance the plot or the story or the characters at all. He talks about how he doesn't want strangers. The citizen says, we don't want strangers in our house. And eventually in that dialogue, Bloom has to remind the citizen that he was born here. This is my home. I was born here just like you were. On and on. My God, it's a long chapter. 70 pages of this joke. At one point, Bloom says, a nation is the same people living in the same place. Kind of Bloom's realistic vision of the world, while the citizen has this glorious the Irish people triumphant and ruling the waves. We'll have a snot rag will show up, someone will blow their nose into something. They'll have a page describing the embroidery of this royal tapestry that has been used and everything is a joke that's too long. There's a funny little bit on page 432 where Bloom at one point says, what you need in a country to make it work is love and not hatred. Very simple. He doesn't want. He's in there, by the way. He doesn't want to talk to the citizen, but he's in there looking for Cunningham, and he says, love is the opposite of hatred. That's what we need. And then there's a little joke that follows it, which is a kind of romantic language love. Love loves to love. Nurse loves the new chemist. Constable 14A loves Mary Kelly. Gertie McDowell loves the boy that has the bicycle. MB loves a fair gentleman, etc., etc. So then we have a kind of a little joke on love solves all the problems. And again, it's interspersed with the normal narrative. Now, they refer to him as the Bloody Dark Horse as you're dragging your way through this long chapter. And they mention again that Bloom's father poisoned himself and had changed his name at one point from something which I forget offhand, but it's Vigriner. It's an East European name. Again, we get into a long Catholic passage of Catholic language and Catholic rituals. And at the end, one of the most famous passages is that Bloom gets really fed up when the citizen is making fun of Jews, and he says, remember, Mendelssohn was a Jew, and Karl Marx, and Mercadante, and Spinoza, and the Savior was a Jew, and his father was a Jew. You're God. We could have got here a lot quicker, but it is a very dramatic moment that will get lost if you're skimming through this like I did the first few times. And he's basically telling the citizen off, who loses his temper after 2 or 3 more big, long joke passages. And he sets Gary Owen, the dog, I think it's a blind dog, because the guy's been beaten it so often, goes after Bloom and chases him out of the bar. And the closing paragraph, as Bloom is running down the street pursued by this dog, we have a religious passage of Bloom being transported to heaven, like amid clouds of angels, ascend to the glory of the brightness and angle, etc. So we have him floating off into this hyperbole of language, and he's actually being chased by a dog. Okay, so Joyce, the next chapter is going to have a lot of this too. There's some very good stuff in the next chapter, but again, they all need to be about 1/3 as long as they are. And I'm sorry if I was a little bit out of it this time, but this chapter does get me pissed off a lot of the time. Okay, take care, and I think you should not worry about skimming those passages if you want to follow the thread. But even if you cut them out completely, the kind of meandering dialogue between all these characters is too long, and you want to get to the meat of it, which is Bloom going after the citizen at the end. Okay, good luck.